There can be love in telling hard truths, David Blanchard tells us. Heifetz, Granshaw, and Linsky, these are authors of some work on adaptive leadership. They write that the reality is that any social system, including an organization or a country or a family, is the way it is because the people in that system, at least those with the most leverage, want it that way. Ouch. The implication being that institutionalized racism and state-sanctioned violence is the way it is because the people in that system with the most leverage want it that way. Adaptive change is that change which, in order to happen, requires us to change. We're far more comfortable with technical problems, which we can fix. Identify the problem, bring in the expert, and fix it. It's the adaptive challenges which are harder for us. They're harder, first of all, because our current paradigm and expertise doesn't work on them. So we don't know what to do and struggle to even figure out what the challenge is. If we knew what it was, that would mean that we had a working paradigm that could guide us. Instead, with an adaptive challenge, we often don't know how to name the challenge, we don't know what to do, and we don't have an expert who can guide us. The expertise we do have worked in previous situations, but not now. Because we don't really understand the scope of the challenge, we have to change ourselves and our thinking. We have to try some experiments and fail. We have to keep on task and not let ourselves get distracted by the problems that are easier to solve but don't matter as much. Some of the most loving things I've ever experienced, I haven't been ready for, wasn't looking for, and nearly didn't recognize. A few of them I didn't want, but all of them have changed me, transformed some part of me, filled in a place that I didn't even know was empty, wrote David Blanchard. I think it's important to frame this discussion in love. There can be love in telling hard truths, said David Blanchard. Most of us find it painful to live at this level of love, but it can be there, even in these most unlikely places. We find ourselves in an unlikely, well, maybe not unlikely, but an unfamiliar place these days. Preaching sermons from a chair at home, or listening to sermons on a computer alone or with members of a single household, wearing a mask to go grocery shopping, holding committee meetings and family gatherings via Zoom. I don't know about you, but I wasn't ready for it, wasn't looking for it, and I don't always recognize the love in it. But it is an act of love that we stay at home or limit travel, distance ourselves from others, and wear a mask. I had actually hoped to be with you this morning in beautiful Bozeman on my way to Yellowstone, my favorite spot on earth, tomorrow. But alas, I speak to you from the Columbia River Basin, the home of the Chinook, Cowlitz, Klickitat, Clackamas, and other indigenous people. It's beautiful here, and I love it. But frankly, I wanted to be with you this morning and be on my way to Yellowstone tomorrow. However, when Washington's governor asked its citizens not to travel, I decided to comply out of an abundance of caution and out of love. Doing these things doesn't eradicate the virus, it just mitigates the spread, flattens the curve, as they say, so that the hospital ICU units don't get all overloaded at once. It's an act of love for the healthcare workers who put themselves at risk by going to work and couldn't do their jobs if all of a sudden everyone needed their care all at once. It's an act of love for the grocery store workers who put themselves at risk by going to work and others in essential services. We also find ourselves in an all too familiar place with the protests sparked by the death of George Floyd, but preceded by so many deaths and followed by more. 52 nights of protest locally here in Portland. This is a familiar place that each time we say must be the last. I've been remembering my trip to Ferguson in 2015 at the year anniversary of the killing of Michael Brown. I went with a member of the church I was serving at the time, the one where your minister, the Reverend Duffy Peet, did his internship, and gathered with many Unitarian Universalists from across the country. We were reminded in the news in June when the president held a rally of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre, and can't help but note that a pandemic preceded that violence by a few years. We're in all too familiar a place. And for those of us for whom the system has mostly worked, we need to change and to be transformed. Present adaptive challenges we face include how to slow the rate of global climate change, eliminate racism and state-sanctioned violence, other isms and human rights violations, this virus. You could argue that the virus is a technical problem, one that we hope will be solved with treatments and cures and vaccines, but it is also an adaptive challenge in that until such technical fixes can be created, we are going to have to adapt to its existence. We have never before solved global climate change. We've only created it. We don't really know how to do it. And though there are a lot of things we know to do, we have to change our habits in order to do them. And though there are a lot of things we know to do, we don't know if these things will be enough or what else there is to learn and do. In order to continue to work on adaptive challenges such as racism or global climate change, we have to maintain a certain urgency about the challenges and sustain the discomfort of not knowing. We have to try a lot of experiments, and we have to learn from the failures of those experiments until we find things that work. This zone of discomfort can be called productive disequilibrium. Productive disequilibrium can exist within our bodies, within our families, our congregation, our nation, our world, and learning to manage this disequilibrium is one of the greatest tasks of being human. It is through that zone of productive disequilibrium, for example, that children acquire language. There has to be urgency, a not knowing, experimentation, failures along the way. I'm going to show you a slide here, which I've found helpful to understand this concept better. And I'm going to try to put it into words for those who can't see the slide very well. What we have here is a graph. The horizontal axis is one of time, left to right, less to more. And the vertical axis describes the balance. The bottom line is comfortable and balanced, easy. And the top of the line is chaos. An imbalance so great we generally can't tolerate it for long. But what I want to talk about this morning is a third of the way down. This zone of productive disequilibrium, this green section where it's uncomfortable but tolerable. It's like balancing on top of a ball. It's really hard to do, and we feel like we're going to fall over any second, and yet with practice, possible. Nevertheless, uncomfortable. Productive distress is labeled. This is labeled in red over here, productive distress. Then on the graph with the horizontal axis of time and the vertical axis of balance to chaos, there's some graphing lines. There's the thin line that starts out at the bottom in the zone of complete imbalance and chaos and goes pretty rapidly, the bottom toward equilibrium, that goes upward into that zone of complete imbalance and chaos, and then goes pretty rapidly down to the bottom of the chart of equilibrium. And this is what happens when we're faced with a technical problem. You know, figuring out how to hold worship when we can't meet in a sanctuary was a technical problem, which many congregations, including the one I serve and yours, solved by implementing Zoom. But I find it interesting the different ways we implemented that technical solution in each congregation. Last June, I preached, or this June, I preached for the Salem, Oregon congregation, and they pre-record their sermons, which allowed me to preach both in Salem and Vancouver on the same Sunday. You hold services live, like our congregation does in Vancouver, but as a smaller congregation, you're using the Zoom meeting format, whereas we hold worship via the webinar format. So mostly this is a technical problem, and many of us have been learning technologies we never thought before we wanted to know. But the ways in which we are implementing these technologies are ways we are adapting worship is adaptive. And I want to talk again about that frame of love. I don't know about this congregation, but in Vancouver, I have felt more love and appreciation for the worship services we've prepared since moving into this platform. People are grateful for the means to connect, even though the technology may have been unfamiliar at the start. So that same thin line that starts at the bottom of the chart where everything's fine and dandy, feels good and in balance, that line describing an adaptive challenge shoots up the chart quickly, getting into that zone of disequilibrium and making us all uncomfortable. The protests in Ferguson following the murder of Michael Brown, or the protests all over the world following the murder of George Floyd, get up into that too hot zone. And there's extreme pressure to resolve and return to equilibrium, which means returning to the social system, to what is familiar, the way it was, because the people in that system with the most leverage wanted it that way. That would be that purple line labeled work avoidance. It doesn't help us with the adaptive challenge. It does restore our sense of calm and balance, at least for those who are not on the receiving end of the injustice every single day. It could be argued that the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 or the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, when mobs of white residents attacked and murdered Black residents and destroyed businesses, were attempts to restore, quote, the balance, because those in power or with the most leverage wanted to restore the social system the way they wanted it. Basically, they didn't want an end to slavery, but to continue to commoditize Black bodies. We've been avoiding the work of anti-racism for a very long time. We've been avoiding the work of human rights for all humans. Humanization, concientización is the word from Paulo Freire, critical consciousness. Collective liberation is the term we're using now, currently. We've been avoiding that work for a very long time. There can be love in telling hard truths, says David Blanchard. Most of us find it painful to live at this level of love, but it can be there even in the most unlikely places. This has been a stressful time for many of us, what with the pandemics of COVID and racism raging in the world, distressful. And this rush to return to normal, though expected, though understandable, is probably work avoidance. Because it is in this distressful time, if we make it productive, that we could actually adapt as a species, change in a way that prevents the next violence. In order to make progress on the uncomfortable issue of racism, we have to stay in that zone of discomfort quite a long time. We have to maintain a sense of urgency while not knowing what to do next, and experimenting a lot, learning from our failures along the way. And most of us find it painful to live at this level of love. I found this chart helpful on so many levels in dealing with my own anxiety when I don't know what to do next because I'm faced with an adaptive challenge. Rather than blaming myself for my inadequacies, remember, love is the key here, or blaming the world for its failures, I'm able to tolerate the discomfort long enough to make progress on whatever adaptive challenge I'm facing. Whether it's changing my personal habits, like things like too little exercise and too much work, or at work, tolerating the inevitable criticism that comes my way as the most public representative of an imperfect human institution. Knowing that the discomfort is a part of making progress toward adaptive change is one strategy for tolerating it longer. My purpose this morning is to help us focus on how to mobilize and sustain ourselves through this period of risk that comes with adaptive change. To understand this distress as productive and as an act of love. I believe our survival as a species depends on our ability to do this. Our survival as individuals depends on our ability to do this. And our survival as an institution depends on our ability to do this. The church is always in the process of facing adaptive challenges, some of which we are aware, others which remain hidden to us. This theory, as I've mentioned, applies on multiple levels in our lives and in society and as a species. The obvious change we're undergoing right now is church without the building. I mean, we always knew the building was not the church, but we are now having to learn that truth in new and different ways. And I can't imagine how much more painful this is for your congregation, just having recently acquired a building, to not be able to meet within those walls. And I wonder what effect this challenge, centering church on the people, not the building, will have on the other challenge we've been stating and struggling with for years, that progress we seek in inclusion, anti-racism, multiculturalism, transgender and gender, non-binary inclusion, neurodiversity, ability, the list goes on. There is not a roadmap or known route to inclusion the way we dream of it. And so we mess up, not knowing what we don't know and forgetting at times to center the experience of those we seek to include. Rather than continuing to center the white, cisgender, temporarily able-bodied experience that still makes up the majority of our congregations and our ministers and leaders, such as myself. We are fish in the water, not even knowing the water we are in. And change is what this is about. It is what will allow us to survive as individuals, as species, and as an institution. This change moment has been magnified by the pandemic, but things are always changing. This institution has undergone considerable change over the years. The institutions to which we belong were changing long before we arrived and will be changing long after we're gone. And some of it is quite uncomfortable. We're still in disequilibrium over several issues in Unitarian Universalism. I say this to you in love, including this adherence to a rigid individualism, the reticence to submit our ideas to the collective wisdom, this desire for increasing inclusivity without letting it actually change us. If we ease the tension too soon, find a temporary place of comfort, we may fail to make the long-term changes necessary to solve and adapt to a new world. The nature of adaptive challenges is that we don't really understand the scope of the challenge. So if I could better name the challenges we face, that would be a sign that they are fixable and technical. So if you think I'm only hinting at difficulties here, you're right. We don't really understand the scope of the challenge. Because we don't, We have to change ourselves and our thinking. We have to try some experiments and fail. We have to keep on task and not let ourselves get distracted by the tasks that are easier to figure out but don't matter as much. It's not helpful, not loving, to think the system is broken and that we have to fix it. It is not an act of love to expect perfection and rely on expertise. It's much harder than that. We are a part of the system, and nobody knows what's next.